Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Hope that wherever you are, you're having a good day. Got a second cup of coffee with you, or a first cup. As you can see, I'm out here in my outdoor office. Before last week, when I did a little detour to talk about aliens, talk about ET, I've been reflecting on the lectionary gospel passages for a number of weeks, and then before that, I looked at the Psalter reading, the psalm for the coming week, and then I was talking with my better half, my smarter half, and what to do next, and we thought about this. I was reading from the Gospels, and then before that the Psalms, and there are different types of literature in the Bible. So when you go to a bookstore, those things that people went to back before there was Amazon, you go into a bookstore and there are different sections. There's a fiction section, and then there's science fiction, and there's history, and then right beside the history there's going to be biography, and there are different genres, and you would pick up and read a history book a little differently than you would read science fiction. A romance novel reads differently than science fiction, even though both fiction, but they read very differently. And you got the same thing going on when you pick up a Bible. And by the way, this is the best kind of Bible. This one is, like, as you can see, quite literally falling apart. And not that particular one is best, but a Bible that has been used so much that it begins to literally fall apart is the best kind, the one that's used. So there are different genres in the Bible. When you pick it up, there are different kinds of stuff in there, and you read those different kinds of things differently. So over the last, 6 weeks or so, I've been reading from one of the Gospels, reading from the Gospel of Luke. So what is a gospel? To begin with, the word gospel is used to translate a Greek word, evangelion. Evangelion means good news, so the gospel is good news. And the term gospel is used a couple of different ways primarily. One is you use it to refer to the good news of Jesus Christ. The good news of Jesus Christ, and so Paul referred to the gospel in his letters. But the term gospel is also used to refer to the first 4 books of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I've got those 2 different ways. You've got the good news. The gospel is the good news that Jesus Christ came to save sinners. And that gospel is included in the 4 books that we know of as gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when you pick up the Bible, are the first 4 books of the New Testament, and they are the gospels. They were written by, 2 of them are written by associates of Jesus, those being Matthew and John, and the other 2, Mark and Luke, were not written. Mark and Luke didn't know Jesus personally, but they were associates of people who did know Jesus. And these 4 Gospels were written say a generation or so. They started to be written, say, a generation or so after the crucifixion. The best guess is that the first of the Gospels started to be written maybe in the mid or late 60s AD, that being Mark, and then Matthew and Luke coming along just a few years after that. And then John was written very late, maybe early in the mid-90s. So the Gospels came along a generation or two after the life of Christ. In fact, the first Christian documents were Paul's letters rather than the Gospels. These Gospels are written to give sort of a written account of the life of Christ. And at that point, by the mid-60s, a lot of the original eyewitnesses, a lot of the original associates of Christ were beginning to die out. And so there's this need to have written down a body of material about his life. And also the faith is becoming more Gentile rather than Jewish. Jewish culture is very oral, and so they pass down large chunks of material by oral tradition, more so than a Gentile world, and so there's this need to get it written down. And so these Gospels were written, like I said, starting mid-late 60s for the Gospel of Mark, and Matthew and Luke coming a few years later, and then at the end, John. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are the four Gospels. Yes, there were other Gospels that were written. Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, etc., etc., etc. There were probably dozens of different Gospels. But all of these others were written many years later. They were all written like well into the 2nd century. And were never used by the broader church. They were apocryphal, and were never used by the broader church. So we have our four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And like I said, 2 are written by eyewitnesses, by followers, and the other 2 are written by people who were associates, and that being Mark and Luke. So if you want to read about the life of Jesus, if you want to read the words of Jesus, read his parables, read about the miracles that he performed, the stories that he told, the stories about him, that sort of stuff. If you want to read about the life of Jesus, pick up one of the Gospels. And some editions of the Gospel, some publications of the Bible, make it easy because they put all the words of Jesus in red. That makes it really easy. You're reading along and, okay, there's red. That's what Jesus said. And one thing to point out when you pick up a Gospel is this. The Gospels they weren't written to be straight objective history. They're not objective biography. And that's a good thing. The Gospel writers were all devout, and they wrote what they wrote to show that Jesus was the Son of God. They wrote the way they did to entice people to follow it. They're not dispassionate, objective observers. And I'm glad they weren't. They're writing with an agenda. They're writing to show something, that Jesus is the Son of God, that he came to save sinners. And so we pick up the Gospels now, and we find 4 different viewpoints on the same basic story. By the early 2nd century, these 4 Gospels were being circulated together, bound together in one volume, and circulated all over the world to the various churches. And then as the canon was developed, the other books were all it came afterwards. So the Gospels are always listed first: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So these Gospels were circulating, these being the core of the teachings about Jesus. And after, and then added to them as they were being circulated, were letters that Paul had written. And Paul's letters, they gave the interpretive framework for how to look at the life of Christ. So the Gospels tell us what happened. And Paul, you might say, tells us what it means, applies it. And then also, so you have the four Gospels. Paul wrote a dozen or so letters, which comprised a good chunk of the New Testament. Luke added a history, and then there are other letters, particularly by Peter. And then at the end, there's an apocalypse, also by John. But we begin with the Gospels. The Gospels tell us the story of Jesus. The Gospels tell us the story of Jesus, slightly different ways, but it's the same basic story. And they're listed first. And then after that, we have a history that Luke wrote. And then we have a lot of letters by Paul. And these letters, like I said, they tell us how to interpret the life of Christ, what it meant. And then we have an apocalypse at the end. But it begins with the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In case you're wondering about that order, Matthew has always been listed first by a matter of tradition. It's always been listed first, even though most people today don't think Matthew is the first to be written. It's always been listed first because in the earliest church, Matthew was the one that was prized the most. The earliest church, that was sort of their default gospel. It's not like the other gospels weren't read, but Matthew was sort of, it was the first among equals, as our British friends would say. And then the others are listed thereafter, and John listed last because it was the last gospel to be written. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are the four gospels, and they tell of the life of Christ. And that word gospel translates a Greek term evangelion, which means good news. And in the Gospels, there is the good news that Jesus Christ came to save sinners, and the Gospels themselves are good news. So the good news is contained in the good news, and that is some really good news on Wednesday. Have a great rest of your day.